Now, the rest of the story. Americans, if you forget everything I say today, except this, it'll be enough. Henry and Simon should have been friends. Simon married Henry's sister, after all, but their personalities clashed, and so did their ideals. Henry the 13th century England's King Henry III and Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, began their relationship amicably enough as king and councillor, soon as relatives by marriage. But then Henry made Simon governor of English-ruled Gascony to restore order there, and while Simon succeeded in civilizing the region, he made so many enemies in the process that the king was compelled to humiliate him publicly, and Simon never forgave nor forgot. And so began one of the most infamous family feuds in all English history. It's called the Battles of the Brothers-in-Law. Governor Simon grew increasingly critical of King Henry, his incompetence, his extravagance, and King Henry acquiesced, obeyed Governor Simon's reforms for a while. But after a few years passed, the king managed to muster enough support to challenge the barons. And thus, hear this carefully, thus did the Battle of the Brothers-in-Law explode into the bloody baronial wars. After an entire year, Simon governed England as leader of the new Parliament. Loyalists called it a military dictatorship, but in any case, Henry's son Edward eventually managed to escape, mobilized an army of loyalists against Simon, and victorious, killed him. But there is a gruesome epilogue to the story of the vindictive king and the renegade governor. For following Simon's defeat and demise at Evesham, his enemies dismembered his corpse and sent that corpse, it is said, on one final, if disjointed, tour of England as a warning to all of the people of what happens to Democrats. But do you want to know something special? The old score between Henry and Simon has been settled. In November of 1992, as a matter of fact, when a present-day descendant of Simon vanquished a present-day descendant of Henry, and it was a different kind of battlefield, and there was no real blood this time, but there was the defeat which hurt just as much, when out of the mists of time, a blood-related champion, Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, rode into battle against a blood-related defender of the honor of King Henry III, the kinsmen of the Democrat and the demagogue, the outsider governor and the sitting king, and this time the outsider emerged triumphant. For the 20th century national leader descended from King Henry was George Bush, Sr., and the victorious governor descended from 13th century Governor Simon. That was who else? Bill Clinton. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Now let me state first and foremost, I was not yet of voting age for the 1992 presidential election. I missed it by just a few months. At the time, I was more interested in playing music, my friends, and girls than in politics. That being said, mostly due to late-night television, I was very aware of the Bush-Clinton election. In the 1988 presidential election, George Herbert Walker Bush won the election against Michael Dukakis and became the 41st President of the United States. It was assumed that Bush would run for re-election, but Bush was unsure. At the time, hundreds of savings and loan companies had overextended their lending, and one of those was a company called Silverado Banking Savings and Loan. Silverado had also overextended its lending, became insolvent when interest rates rose, and the federal government had to use taxpayers' money to repay the depositors. Neil Bush, one of the president's sons, had been on Silverado's board of directors. The media used Neil as a poster boy for the savings and loan crisis. He appeared before a congressional committee and answered a barrage of hostile questions. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation opened an investigation, filed charges, but it was ultimately settled out of court. Bush believed that Neil was singled out because he was the president's son, and he was uncertain that he wanted to put his family through the scrutiny that comes with a presidential election again. Also, First Lady Barbara Bush had recently been diagnosed with Graves' disease, a thyroid condition that can cause weight loss and serious eye problems. Shortly after the First Lady was diagnosed with Graves' disease, he too, the president, had been diagnosed with Graves' disease. But ultimately, George Bush said he saw the presidency as a mission and he was determined to complete it. President Bush began 1992 with a tour of Asia, which ended in Japan. At the end of one long day, the President and the First Lady attended a banquet with the Japanese Prime Minister. Bush had been feeling ill all day, but was too polite to cancel on his host. Halfway during the meal, nausea overtook the President. His head drooped and the President passed out. He fell sideways into the lap of the Prime Minister and vomited. He quickly regained consciousness. The Secret Service rushed to his aid. Trying to make light of the situation, the ill president quipped, "Why don't you just roll me under the table and you can go on with the banquet?" The embarrassed president excused himself from the banquet and returned to his hotel room to lie down. The First Lady remained at the banquet and made the toast that the president was prepared to make. The story made international news, and the incident became fodder for late-night television comedians. In the week that followed, the clip of the president vomiting on the Japanese Prime Minister was shown repeatedly on TV. People wondered if the president was well enough to withstand 4 more years as president. If re-elected, would he die in office? If this happened, did the country want Dan Quayle, the vice president, to become president? The 1992 presidential election was certainly a heated, albeit bloodless, battle. The economy had been growing since the recession of the 1980s, but by 1990, economic growth had slowed nearly to a halt. The country was in another recession. During his first presidential campaign, Bush made a promise.
My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
Despite Bush's "read my lips, no new taxes," he ultimately agreed to some budget cuts and new taxes. The general public was bitter about the deficit reduction plan. They felt betrayed. In that upcoming election, President Bush had 2 main opponents: Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton and Texas businessman Ross Perot. Although not a politician, Ross Perot had plenty of money to spend on an election campaign, the theme of which was anti-establishment and anti-incumbent. That meant anti-George Bush. The media was thrilled to have a new face in the race, one with so much character. His large ears, which he joked about himself, and high-pitched, nasally voice were cartoon-like. But let me tell you, he meant business. While still gaining momentum, though, Ross Perot unexpectedly dropped out of the race. Now the race was just between President George Bush and Governor Bill Clinton. Clinton was a formidable opponent, and George Bush knew it. Clinton was of a younger generation, just 45 years old at the time, the same age as George W. Bush, the president's son. George W. Bush said that Clinton had a charming personality, was a superb campaigner who had been elected governor 5 times. To top it all off, the name of Clinton's hometown was a campaign theme in itself. He was from a town in Arkansas called Hope. To appeal to younger voters, Clinton appeared on the Arsenio Hall show wearing a suit, Ray-Ban shades, and playing the saxophone. I remember watching that episode, and I have to say, I was impressed. Clinton's campaign focused on the struggling economy. His campaign slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." And that slogan was aimed directly at President Bush. Many people thought the president was out of touch, when they saw a news story in which the president tried a new type of electronic grocery scanner at a grocery store. Do you remember that? Then something unexpected happened. Ross Perot re-entered the presidential race. What? During a presidential debate in St. Louis, Ross Perot explained his views of the deficit reduction plan and ended with a quip: "If there's a fairer way, I'm all ears." Now his ears were a prominent feature, and the crowd roared. During another presidential debate held in Richmond, Virginia, Clinton seemed completely at ease. Rather than sitting stoic in a chair, he walked slowly around the stage as he thought about his answers. President Bush remained in his seat. At one point, Ross Perot was giving a long-winded answer to a question, and the cameras caught President Bush as he nonchalantly looked at his wristwatch. The media loved it, as did late-night comics. The president came across as being bored. Did he have someplace better to be? So when the votes were counted on the evening of November the 3rd, 1992, Clinton won 43% of the vote, Bush received almost 38%, and Perot claimed 19%. William Jefferson Clinton became the 42nd President of the United States. After Clinton completed his 2 terms as president, the 43rd President of the United States asked the former presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton, to lead a fundraising drive for victims following a massive tsunami in the Indian Ocean. That president, number 43, was George W. Bush. Both former presidents agreed, and despite that bitter 1992 presidential election, they became good friends and remained good friends for the remainder of George Herbert Walker Bush's life. Strange how things can turn out, don't you think? And now you know the rest of the story. I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.